Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Get Your Popcorn podcast. Today we will be deep diving It's a Wonderful Life. This movie came out in 1946 and has become a Christmas classic. The film follows the character of George Bailey, who on Christmas Eve has decided to end his life, and which his guardian angel comes down to intervene and shows him what an impact he has had in a positive way to those around him. This film, when initially released, was a box office bomb. It barely made back the budget. It was so unsuccessful that the studio did not renew its copyright, and then in 1974 it expired, and television studios were able to use the film without paying any sort of royalty to anybody, and so it was played over Christmas every single year and has gained a cult following from its annual releases. And so we all have this perception that it was always a Christmas classic, but it's only been since the mid to late 70s and since that it's been growing in popularity. This film is iconic and it's a must-see Christmas movie. I don't go a single year without watching it. This and Elf are my absolute must-sees. The film remains in preservation at the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress for its cultural impact. There apparently is a modern remake happening. It has been directed by Kenya Barris and is in development at this stage. However, I do not believe that remakes should be a thing. There's very select few things in which that is fine. Things like A Star is Born that have been repeatedly done in a slightly different way. There's the Nosferatu film, which has been released, but I haven't seen yet because the first one is from 1922 and doesn't include any sound or any talking from the actors, just title cards. That's fine. But as a rule, I do not see remakes, especially something that's so iconic as It's a Wonderful Life. I will definitely not be viewing that whatsoever. I'm not going to dive too much into casting on this one other than Jimmy Stewart, who I think is fantastic in this film. I think because of the nature of it and the talk of suicide, which is something now that isn't talked about despite its frequency, but especially in 1946, I feel that Jimmy Stewart's portrayal of someone that is on the edge of that it's incredible. During this movie, you watch Jimmy Stewart or the character of George Bailey, you see the decline in his mental health through various circumstances and things he's had to trade off, and you can really see how somebody's life impacts the way that they progress. And even though they are making such a positive impact around them because they are taking these negative hits themselves, it does show the crumbling of someone's mental health. I find his portrayal to be really beautiful and really honest. As somebody who has both struggled with suicidal ideation in the past, and then I have a personal relationship with it. I had a friend pass away from suicide. I found this film, it's so profound, and then now having watched it since the loss of my friend, for me it just hits so close to home. And I think that's a rarity in some of the films of this time. A lot of the films they're more professional, they're more slick with the dialogue, they don't hit as emotional. This is before things like method acting and places like the Actors Studio. This is before Lee Strasberg really got into a lot of the actors that you see with the performances from like Al Pacino, Jane Fonda later in film development. This is before that. So I think it is quite remarkable for an actor of Jimmy Stewart's day to be portraying something so serious and do it so honestly is really ahead of its time. And then we have Donna Reed, who plays Mary, who is George Bailey's wife, and watching her performance as a wife who's struggling with being married to somebody who has changed so much the decline of their mental health. I think is really honest because she's deeply doing everything she can to keep her family together, keep her kids kind of out of it, trying to protect them, and be there for her husband, who is ultimately changed so much from the person that he was due to the decline in his mental health. And her performance as a supporting character for this, I think also is, although it's much more understated than the performance of Jimmy Stewart, because she's a background character. She's also a character who's a woman in the 1940s. So, it's not as pronounced. Women in general were a little more background, just based on the nature of society. But I think her performance cannot be disregarded, because it is such, Jimmy Stewart wouldn't be able to go to that level if he didn't have the support of Donna Reed behind him. Henry Fonda was also considered for the role of George Bailey. I'm really glad that he didn't, although I do like him as an actor, particularly in 12 Angry Men and Jezebel. I think that's where he really shines. However, those are super dialogue-heavy movies and not overly emotional. He rejected the notion of method acting a lot, where Jimmy Stewart was a lot more open to it. Jane Fonda actually deep dives into her father's craft of acting really well in her autobiography, so that's worth a read. But I don't think Henry Fonda would have been able to bring what Jimmy Stewart did to this role. And then for the casting of Mary, it is a little more well-rounded in terms of who was considered. People like Olivia de Havilland and Ginger Rogers were considered. Ginger Rogers, I think, is obviously not a great fit, but Olivia de Havilland would have been a great choice. She's so good as Melanie in Gone with the Wind. However, it is kind of a typecast as well. Melanie and Mary are one and the same, women who stand by their husbands, even though their husbands are not necessarily in a great place. So I think she would have been able to slide into that role, but ultimately I do think Donna Reed was the right choice. Frank Capra directed this film. He had 3 different cinematographers working with him throughout the film, so it somewhat has inconsistent tone in terms of that. The direction style is fine. I don't think it's anything to phone home about, but it is good. Also, I think it's important to remember at this point, they've only been making movies with sound for about 15 years. So when comparison to the direction style and the creativeness of today's films, it is hard to compare, because this is an extremely new technology at this point. Okay, so let's get into the plot. So the film starts Christmas Eve, 1945, in a small town called Bedford Falls. George Bailey is contemplating suicide. We know this because the film opens up with a shot of space where we see lights flashing and voices overhead, and it is the voice of God, and he's speaking to an angel, and they're discussing that George Bailey is about to throw away his greatest gift. Sorry, I think I will get teary during this podcast episode just based on things that have happened for me, so bear with me. I don't like to pull any of that shit out of the podcast. I think that's why podcasts are better than overly produced things, because it's real and this is my life and this is my opinion. So if I tear up, just bear with me. All that means is that the film impacted me deeply. So they're discussing that George Bailey's going to throw away his greatest gift. So they call over Clarence, who is a guardian angel who has not gotten his wings yet. And they are discussing that George Bailey's going to throw away his life, and Clarence needs to be sent down to help him. But in order for Clarence to actually help him, he needs to understand who George Bailey is. So then we flash back in time, and this is where we start going over George Bailey's life and all the different people around him that he's impacted. The first scene that we see is George Bailey and his friends, and they're sledding down a hill, and one of the kids sleds down the hill and falls through the ice. George Bailey rescues him. It's his little brother. And in rescuing him from drowning because of the water, he loses hearing in his left ear. The scene then cuts to the next one where it's George working at a drugstore. There's 2 little girls sitting at the counter. One of them is named Mary. who is later the character of Mary, who becomes his wife, and another one is named Violet. They're talking. Violet has a crush on George, but she's got a crush on every boy. But Mary loves George, and George's making her I think a milkshake, and she kind of leans over and says, "Is this the ear you can't hear out of?" And he doesn't respond, so she knows that he does, and she says, "I will love you till the day I die." Now, while George Bailey is working at the drugstore, the pharmacist that he works for is very clearly drunk and upset and crying. And he's working in the back, and he's making the medication for George to then go out and deliver. And George finds this letter saying that the pharmacist's son has died. And the pharmacist, George Bailey, kind of puts it all together that this is what's happening and that the pharmacist is very drunk. And in sort of looking around to assess the situation, he realizes that the pharmacist has put poison in the pills that George is supposed to deliver. Now, George doesn't deliver the pills because he knows that they're poison. He doesn't know what to do. He goes to see his father, but his father's in a big business meeting with this man named Mr. Potter, who's kind of the big business guy in the town. Mr. Potter then criticizes George Bailey's dad. George Bailey takes this quite personally and yells at Mr. Potter, then goes back to the drugstore, where the pharmacist is very angry because he received phone calls that George has not delivered the medication. And because it's 1946 and we are able to, or I guess it's 1919 in the time period for that, but the movie still is in 1946, the pharmacist slaps George across the face. Obviously, this isn't something that would be in a film today because that's just not the way that the world operates. You can't just hit kids, let alone kids that aren't even like yours, just kids that work for you. But after that happens, George explains what he was trying to, oh my God, I cried through this whole film. But the pharmacist has done, and then the pharmacist breaks down in tears and hugs him and thanks him. We then flash forward to 1928, and George is planning on going on a world tour. He's got some luggage in a suitcase. He's been working with his father for the last 4 years to save up, and now he's going to go off and do his own thing. At the same time, his younger brother Harry, that he had saved from drowning, is graduating high school. And he invites George to come to the dance, or the prom. And George kind of reluctantly agrees. And who does he run into? But Mary. And he asks her to dance, and they have this lovely evening. There's a really cute scene where there's two boys that were wanting to dance with Mary. One was Mary's date, and they decide that they're going to open up the dance floor because the dance floor is put over a pool, and they do, and then George and Mary fall in, and because they're all wet, Mary then gets a robe, and then George is walking her home in this robe, and they have this really sweet scene where they're singing Buffalo Gals, and George says, "I'd do anything for you, Mary. What do you want? I'll get you anything in the world. Do you want the moon? I'll lasso the moon and I'll pull it down for you." And while they're in the middle of this lovely scene and this lovely evening, George receives news that his father has died of a stroke. And after his father's death, the board of directors for his business essentially say that they're going to shut down and close the doors and sell to Mr. Potter, who was the head business guy in the town who nobody likes unless George doesn't go off on his world tour and he stays to run the business with his uncle Billy. And reluctantly, George agrees to keep the business open in kind of memory of his father, and so he gives the money that he was going to take the world tour with to Harry to go to college. Harry's supposed to then return from college and take over the business so that George can then go off. But following Harry's college time, he comes back for a visit, and he has gotten married and decided to take a job with his father-in-law, and so he says he will not be coming back to run the business alone. At this point, Mary and George rekindle their relationship, and they have a scene where all of the people are trying to take the money out of the building and loan. I believe it's supposed to be Black Tuesday, but it's unclear. They're just putting a run on the bank, and George is trying to keep everyone from taking out their money and is explaining how loan investment works. And if they pull all their money, then the business goes under, and then the only person in the town that they can borrow money from or get mortgages or anything like that is Mr. Potter. And Mr. Potter is has high interest rates. His the rental places he has are basically slums. Like, he doesn't care about these people. Where George's building and loan is much more understanding, much more community focused. So he's trying to plead with these people, please don't take all your money out of here and have my business go under, because then I can't help you and help the community. And so Mary pipes up, and they've had this honeymoon money saved, and Mary decides that all of the people that are in line in the bank to take their money out, she says, well, we'll divide this up. What do you actually need to get through for the next week until the next paychecks come in to get by? And so people are going $11, $7.50, $20, and it's all from George and Mary's honeymoon fund. George is then able to keep the business open, so then the people don't have to go crawling to Potter for what they need. George's business continues to be successful, and he ends up building a place called Bailey Park, which is where there's affordable housing that is of a good quality that is now an option for the people in the community. We then jump forward to Christmas Eve, and the town is now preparing to welcome Harry back. He has gone off to World War II and become a fighter pilot, and they're throwing a big celebration because he's prevented a kamikaze attack and ended up saving a bunch of lives. And before this party, Uncle Billy has a deposit of $8,000, which I just did the conversion for right now, is about $150,000 US that he needs to deposit at the bank. And while he's at the bank, he runs into Potter, and he's kind of taunting him, saying that you can't keep the Bailey boys down. And he's pointing out in the newspaper the celebration of what Harry's done with his military career. And during this, he wraps the cash in the newspaper and accidentally leaves the newspaper on the table. Potter then notices that Billy's done this, and he takes the newspaper and the cash. And then Billy is in a panic, and he can't figure out where he's left this. He can't figure out whether it was lost or stolen or what's happened. George is then in a meeting with the bank examiner, and they're going over all their files, and there's $8,000 unaccounted for that hasn't been deposited, and this is what Billy's lost. And now they're facing not only the closure of their business, but prison time as well. George then goes crawling to the only person that he can to try and get a loan for this money, and that's Potter. Potter, of course, has the money and doesn't tell George. And George offers up his life insurance policy. Potter declines it and then calls the police to get George to go into jail. George then runs to a bar and gets drunk, and then is standing on the bridge and prays to God and tells him that he is contemplating suicide. And this is where we link up to the beginning of the film. George then goes to a bridge, and he is standing on the edge of this bridge, and he's getting ready to jump, which I think, for me, post everything that happened, it was so hard to watch. And I watched the first half of the film this year with my husband, where they're going through George's life and all this positive impact, and you're sort of seeing the decline of everything, and then we get to this moment. And I had to stop. I couldn't watch. It's so moving. And Jimmy Stewart's performance is so committed and so honest. It's so powerful. And I think if you're someone who's ever struggled with depression, you just feel the scene, like wait. And it just brought me back to all those times, especially after having my baby, where I felt like this. It was so powerful. So as George is about to jump, Clarence, the guardian angel, jumps in ahead of him And George, seeing that this man is drowning, like jumps in to save Clarence and pulls him out. And him and George get into a discussion about how they're terrible, and then George wishes he was never born. And Clarence says, "Do you really mean that?" And George says, "Of course." And Clarence goes, "Okay." And he makes it so that George was never born. And then Clarence takes George on a tour of the town, and showing him what would happen if George never existed. So they then go on a tour of the town, Bedford Falls, which is now called Pottersville, because without George Bailey's building and loan, when the rush on the run on the banks happened, the only person they had to go through was Potter. So Potter bought all the businesses and the banks, and so now he essentially owns the town. George learns that the pharmacist, Mr. Gower, went to prison for manslaughter because without George there to notice that the poison was in the pills, the pills were delivered, and the child that was supposed to receive them died. So not only has Mr. Gower gone to prison, but he's now been released and he's become the town drunk and homeless. They learn that Uncle Billy was institutionalized following the closure of the building and loan, that the stress of it made him go insane. And in walking through the town, they pass the cemetery and they find Harry's grave. And Harry, of course, died in 1919 in a drowning accident because George wasn't there to save him. And of course, because he drowned as a child, an entire troop in the army was killed because Harry wasn't there to stop the kamikazes. And as they're walking down the street, George sees Mary and finds that she's an old maid, that she never married, she's alone, she's a librarian, which, I mean, to be honest, now, like, in 2024, who cares? It's fine to be an old maid, but we're talking about 1946, and to be an old maid was pretty frowned upon. There wasn't a lot of options for women. You wanted to be a teacher or a nurse or a librarian, and you pretty much did that until you got married, and then you stayed home and have kids. So this, I think, doesn't hit as hard now as it would have in 1946, because I know plenty of women that have fulfilling lives who are career-oriented and didn't get married and don't have families, and they contribute immense amounts to society and have such a positive impact. And so I think because it's 1946, this is supposed to be such an act of shame, how terrible for Mary that she never married. But, if we're looking through today's lens, it really isn't a big deal. So you have to kind of think about it when watching the scene more in terms of where the culture was at in 1946. Anyway, so George grabs Mary, and she, of course, doesn't recognize him because George has never existed, and she screams and she runs away. So George races back to the bridge where he was standing, waiting to jump, and he begs God for his life back. And this is something I think for me it was so hard to watch, because I just wish that there was some sort of failed system, some sort of, are you sure selection in life for people who are struggling with their mental health. Because I think people get to these dark moments and they end their life, and there isn't this system in place that is in this movie where they get to go back through and see the positive impact around them, and that they have meant so much to so many people. And so when I later finished this movie, I had to watch it on my own this year just because I was hysterical, and sometimes you just don't want to be that way in front of other people. This is I thought so much about my friend, and I just wish, you don't tell people what they mean to you as often as you should. And so through the character of George Bailey, we see all the things that he's done, but he doesn't realize it because that's just how he goes through the world. He doesn't think twice about these decisions he's making. Of course, he's going to stay for the building loan for his family, even though it impacts him a little bit, and he doesn't have this world traveling life that he wanted to and be a bachelor, but he has all these things and he did them and they had such a positive impact on everyone. These small everyday things, and I just think a lot about my friend, and I wish I had told her what she meant to me. And so if you have anyone in your life, not even if they're struggling with their mental health, but just the scene always reminds me, just tell people what they mean to you and tell them you love them and why you love them, because you never know what's going on in somebody's head. And somebody may be thinking about this, and then you might say, I love this thing you do, whether it's something small or big, or this moment that I always think of you, or just tell people you love them and why you love them while they're here. Anyway, so George begs for his life back, and his wish is granted, and he runs home, and he sees the sign Bedford Falls, and he's so happy, and he's running back to his life. He runs home and he knows he's going to get arrested, but he's just so happy that he didn't end it, that he's here and all the people he loves are here and they're who they are and what they're supposed to be. And meanwhile, while all this has been happening, where George is going to Mr. Potter and he's been contemplating all this stuff, Mary has rallied the townspeople to help George. And they've told, Billy has explained what's happened and that he lost the money accidentally, and the townspeople, because of all the things that George has done over the years, donate what they can and raise enough money to replace what's gone. So George is no longer in trouble, and the building and loan stays open, and he doesn't have to go to jail. And Harry comes home, and they have their party, and he toasts to George, the richest man in town. And among the donations, he finds a book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, in which Clarence has written an inscription that says, "Remember, no man is a failure who has friends. Thanks for the wings." And one of the bells on the Christmas tree rings, and one of George's kids is there, and she says, "Teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings." And then everyone starts caroling, and that is the end of the film. And this is my favorite Christmas movie, and I know this movie cops a lot of shit because it is so emotional and so sad, but I think in Christmas time we kind of lose the perspective of what Christmas is about, and not to be all Linus from Charlie Brown about this situation, but Christmas really is about spending time together with loved ones, and I think that this highlights who we really are to each other, even if we don't realize that about ourselves and what we're doing and how much impact we can have on other people without really noticing it. So I know that this movie is a little bit sad, and this movie is from 1946, and not everything translates to a modern audience, but I just feel like you shouldn't go your life without seeing this movie, even if you just see it the one time. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Most of the things on this podcast are going to be stuff that I am recommending and things I've already seen or have been on my list for a long time. But don't let a movie because it's from 1946 deter you. Movies a lot of the times from a long time ago are better because they weren't mass producing films. The studios were only producing a certain amount of movies a year, and because of that there was more attention and to detail on the films that they were producing. And this is one of them, although initially it wasn't much of a success. But for me, that probably has, in my opinion, a lot to do with the tone and the nature of the film. The film is much more emotional than the average film in the 1940s. This film was also released pretty close following World War II, so there was a sense of low mood and sadness in society. And this is about a film about hard times of economic troubles as well, and how that really impacts the community. And we're only 6 years out from the Depression at this point. So, I think that did contribute to why this wasn't a box office success. This isn't a happy Christmas movie like White Christmas, where there's amazing dance numbers and songs and all that stuff that the audience at that time were really used to having in movies like that. A good portion of movies were musicals. And this isn't that. This is a much more deeply cut film. It has a huge emotional impact. But yeah, don't let a movie being black and white or being old, quote unquote, deter you. There's so many films out there that are amazing. So I recommend this one if you're somebody who easily cries like me. Get a box of tissues. But yeah, pop your popcorn and crack a Diet Coke, because this one is worth it. And thanks for joining me on another episode and listening to me cry. I'm going to hopefully, for our third episode, get a movie that doesn't make me cry, so I'm not just embarrassingly crying on the internet, in case anybody I know finds this. That's embarrassing if you heard me cry. No, you didn't. Okay, well, I hope everybody has a great Boxing Day, and thanks for joining me.